Good evening. My name is Mohsen Milani, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies here at the USF World. I welcome all of you to this conversation with Dr. Gary Samore. Before I introduce the gentleman who is going to introduce Gary, let me just say a few words about what we are planning for the next 4 to 5 months. And then if you are interested, please sign up with your email and we'll give you the information about those events. One event which has been funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace is going to be a one-day conference about Afghanistan in 2014. As the U.S. troop is beginning to withdraw from Afghanistan, we'll invite a couple of experts to come and talk about how they see the major challenges in Afghanistan in 2014. But the major conference we are going to have is in February or March of 2014. It is going to be a two-day conference called the Greater Middle East and Central Asia in year 2020. We are going to discuss 5 major themes, and we are going to invite about 10 expertise, and I'm very happy to tell you that Dr. Gary Samore has already agreed to be one of those speakers. We are going to address democratization, energy security, terrorism, Islamic movements, and U.S. foreign policy in year 2020. The purpose of the conference is to talk about the future trend and how they impact American national security interests. Please understand that today's program is being live streamed, and so during the question and answer, you want to make sure you shine so that we have good reputation for our USF students and faculty. Now, let me introduce Dr. Roger Brindley, who is sitting right there and who will introduce Gary. Dr. Roger Brindley is Vice Provost and USF System Associate Vice President for USF World at the University of South Florida. He currently leads USF World, overseeing the global engagement of USF, ranked 27 among top American research universities. So Dr. Samore, be on the alert. USF is catching up with Harvard. Raised in the United Kingdom, Roger completed his undergraduate degrees in London before heading to the United States. He originally came to the US to coach real football, which we call soccer, and to complete his Master's of Education at Berry College, Georgia. His Doctor of Education was completed at the University of Georgia. A professor at USF for 17 years, he has received Outstanding Undergraduate Teaching Award and USF President's Award for Faculty Excellence. And he was identified as an honored professor by the National Society of Collegiate Scholars in 2010. Dr. Brindley has served on national and international committees, has written numerous articles in North American and European publications, and served as editor for 3 major international journals. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Roger Brindley.
Thank you, Mohsen. Good evening. On behalf of the University of South Florida and USF World, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very important conversation tonight. It's always a pleasure to see my faculty colleagues, but I'm delighted to see so many students in the audience tonight. I'm very proud of the insatiable appetite that our students bring to these kinds of important conversations. And I also want to welcome our wonderful community colleagues and friends. I know there are a good number of the Tampa Bay community with us tonight, so welcome to you all. At USF World, we promote internationalizing the curriculum, which is one of the university's strategic goals. We also encourage content-based global literacy and globalizing academic success. Both of these missions require that we use our campus to be a lively marketplace for debating controversial issues, as well as educating our students about the global politics and the key challenges that our country faces today. We've made impressive advances in both of these areas here at the University of South Florida, but we all know there's much still to do. It was in the spirit of realizing these dual goals that the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies was established more than a year ago. The center is designed to serve as a bridge among academia, the private sector, and the government, focusing on issues pertinent to strategy, diplomacy, and global security. Among other things, the center develops academic programs and organizes conferences. In December 2012, the Scanning the Horizon Conference was organized by the center in collaboration with the Near East and South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. The conference was sponsored by Central Command's academic consortium. Dr. Mohsen Milani, the executive director of the center, established the Conversation series on global security in 2012, and tonight is the 12th conversation in that series. It is designed to initiate thoughtful discussion about major global security challenges, and I can honestly tell you, these conversations are a constant highlight in my academic calendar now. I cannot think of two more important global challenges today than Iran's nuclear program and Syria's chemical weapons program. For the past decade, Iran and the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany, have been negotiating with Iran to find a more peaceful resolution to the nuclear impasse. The West continues to believe that Iran is seeking to build a nuclear bomb. Iran, however, insists that its nuclear program is entirely for peaceful processes. President Rouhani has now promised to resolve Iran's nuclear dispute with the United States in less than 1 year. Most surprisingly, he and President Obama had a telephone conversation last month, the first conversation between the leaders of these two countries for more than 33 years. For some, Mr. Rouhani sincerely wants to resolve Iran's nuclear program. For others, he is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Who is he? And is there a realistic chance that Iran's nuclear dispute could be resolved peacefully? The Syrian civil war is another major international challenge. For the past 2 years, this bloody conflict has resulted in the death of over 110,000 innocent people. The armed opposition to President Assad is not strong enough to defeat him, nor is President Assad sufficiently powerful to defeat his enemies. We have, therefore, what some experts are calling a stalemate. A few weeks ago, the Syrian government reportedly used chemical weapons against its own citizens. In reaction, the international community has agreed to dismantle these weapons. The big question now is, will President Assad continue to cooperate with the inspectors, or will he try to undermine the inspection process? In the last moments, I've raised a number of key questions about Iran and Syria. I cannot think of a more qualified individual to address them than our distinguished guest, Dr. Gary Samore. Dr. Samore is the Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Prior to that, he served for 4 years as President Obama's White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction. From 2006 to 2009, Dr. Samore was Vice President for Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Before joining that council, he was Vice President for Global Security and Sustainability at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. Dr. Samore was Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Non-Proliferation and Export Controls during the Clinton administration. In 1995, he received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Meritorious Civilian Service for his role in negotiating the 1994 North Korea nuclear agreement. He received his MA and his PhD from Harvard University in 1984. Would you please join me in a very warm welcome, Dr. Samore, to the University of South Florida.
Well, good evening again. This afternoon, I had the pleasure of having lunch with Gary, and it was a 2-hour-long lunch, and we discussed a lot of issues. And at the end of the lunch, I asked him, do you mind if we repeat what we did during our lunch, but a sort of edited version of it? And he agreed. So what I would like to do is have a conversation about Iran and Syria with Gary for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer. But before I start my question, I want to personally express my appreciation to you for agreeing to come to our university. I know you're in high demand. You just appeared and faced Meet the Press last week. You travel a lot, and not only you know a great deal about the issues we're going to discuss, you're exceptionally sharp and articulate. And it is really a great honor for me personally, and I think for the university, to have somebody of your caliber. So thank you very much for agreeing to come to USF. And please give him another nice round of applause.
Well, let me just say thank you to Mohsen and to Roger and to all of you for coming. This is a great opportunity for me to speak to you, and I'm really happy that I've had a chance to escape the coming winter in Boston, at least for 48 hours.
I want to start by asking you to tell the audience about what you actually did in the past, during the first term of President Obama. Tell us about your average day at the White House.
Well, mostly I wrote memos and attended meetings, which is what everybody does in the government. But there were 3 main areas of activity, I would say. The first and the most important was dealing with the countries that pose a direct threat to the United States and to our allies. So that's primarily Iran and North Korea. And those cases are quite different, but in both cases we use all of the instruments we have available, diplomacy, sanctions, covert action, military threats, in order to try to slow down or prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons and long-range missiles that could threaten the U.S. and our allies. The second important part of the job was preventing terrorist groups from acquiring nuclear weapons, and that mainly involved working with other governments at the level of law enforcement and intelligence and nuclear experts to make sure that nuclear materials and weapons were secure and accounted for. And most of that work takes place, below the radar screen. It's not in the newspapers. It's done at the expert level. But President Obama wanted to elevate the visibility of the nuclear security issue, and so he founded a series of nuclear security summits, starting in Washington in April in 2010. We had about 50 heads of state come to this meeting to talk about the nuclear security issue and steps that leaders could take to deal with the threat of nuclear terrorism. And then the second summit was in Seoul in 2012. The next one will take place in The Hague next year, and then President Obama has agreed to host the final nuclear security summit in 2016 in Washington. So that was an important piece of work, and even though it was, as I say, done, not in public, I do think we were successful in terms of making it more difficult for terrorist groups to acquire either nuclear weapons or nuclear material. And then the third main activity is managing relations with the other big nuclear powers, primarily Russia and China. And in the first term, of course, we negotiated a new arms control agreement with Russia that reduced US strategic forces. And for President Obama, the Joint Chiefs and Stratcom have advised him that the US could reduce its nuclear forces even further by 1/3. And President Obama has said publicly he would like to reach another agreement with Russia to make that reduction, but unfortunately President Putin does not appear to be interested in further reductions without dealing with the missile defense issue, which I think is unlikely. So those were the three main pieces of work, and I would say Iran was the one that I was probably most personally involved in. I attended almost all of the P5+1 meetings with the Iranians, both at the head of delegation and at the expert level.
This is the 5 permanent members of the...
5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, plus the EU, plus Iran, and their delegation was then headed by a man named Dr. Jalili, who was the head of the National Security Council for the Supreme Leader.
Yes.
And they were very frustrating negotiations, and little was achieved.
We'll get to Iran in a second, but before getting to Iran, let me go back to the White House. So I assume you had a lot of meetings with President Clinton as well as with President Obama about different issues. When you meet these presidents, or any president, is that different than when you meet me? Is that a different kind of atmosphere? Do you,
well, I was
honestly,
lucky.
do you get nervous because here is the most powerful man
Yes.
sitting?
Yes, and there's something about the Situation Room that's makes it very
Are you nervous
difficult.
now talking with me?
I'm not particularly
Good.
nervous
I'm
now.
very happy.
But the Situation Room is this kind of windowless, airless cubicle. And it's a very small room, and you have sitting around the table, you know, the President and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the head of the CIA. And, you know, usually I wouldn't be sitting at the table. I'd be sitting, you know, along the back row, but quite close. And if the President turns to me and asks me to say something, then you feel like you're on the spot.
Now let's move away from the White House and go to Iran. In June, President Hassan Rouhani was elected president of Iran with 51% of the vote, and he defeated 7 other rivals. He was the most moderate of the 8 candidates. And he has started this charm offensive, and he has said on numerous occasions that he wants to resolve Iran's nuclear crisis, and he wants to improve relations with the US. Now, I happen to be cautiously optimistic. I think you are a little bit less optimistic than I am. Please try to convince me why I shouldn't be cautiously optimistic.
Well, I mean, first of all, I agree with your assessment that Rouhani was elected with a mandate to try to improve the Iranian economy, and he understands that requires an agreement with the US to lift sanctions, because these sanctions have really taken a very serious toll on the Iranian economy and have produced some public unhappiness. So there's some pressure on the Iranian government, and especially on President Rouhani, to produce a deal. My skepticism, or my question, is whether the Supreme Leader and the more conservative factions, including the Islamic Republic, including the Islamic Guard, will be willing to give Rouhani enough flexibility so that he can offer the kind of nuclear concessions the US will demand as a condition for sanctions relief. And in particular, I think the US and our European allies in these so-called P5+1 talks, we will want to impose physical limits on Iran's enrichment program in terms of the number, the types of centrifuges, the stockpile of enriched uranium, so that Iran doesn't have the capacity to quickly produce enough weapons-grade material for nuclear weapons. And right now, the Iranians have 18,000 of their first-generation centrifuge machines installed. Only about half of them are operating. I think the US will want to see that number reduced as a condition for sanctions relief. And right now, I don't see much evidence that the Supreme Leader is prepared to roll back the achievements they've made over the last decade. So I think the two sides are very far apart on a comprehensive deal. You know, where I share your cautious optimism is that I could imagine a very preliminary interim agreement in which we would agree to some modest relief of sanctions, and the Iranians would agree to some modest nuclear constraints. And that at least would get the diplomatic process started, but I think we're a long way away from a resolution.
Well, obviously, a relationship that has been based on mutual animosity, hatred, basically a Cold War type, is not going to be repaired overnight. And anybody who expects Iran to close down its nuclear facilities, I think, is delusional. It's not going to happen unless we attack Iran and occupy the country. Considering the reality of Iran, what do you think is a good deal from an American point of view? And then I'll tell you what I think, whether the Iranians will agree with this or not. Well, give me 2 or 3 major ingredients of something that would allow President Obama to lift through executive order some of the sanctions and can actually sell it to the American people. What should Iran do?
Well, the current offer on the table, which the P5+1 have made to Iran, proposes that Iran would shut down Qom, would stop operating centrifuges.
This is the underground.
That's the underground facility is built under a mountain in order to be impregnable, and contains a small number of centrifuges, a couple of thousand. So shut down Qom, ship out a large amount of the 20% enriched uranium that Iran has produced, and stop producing any more enriched uranium above 5%. In return, the P5+1 offered to lift some of the sanctions, in particular the restrictions on trade in petrochemicals and precious metals. Now, the Iranian response was, we will stop producing temporarily enriched uranium above 5%, but in return, we want all the sanctions lifted, including the financial sanctions and the sanctions that are limiting Iran's oil exports. So both sides accept that there's a quid pro quo, sanctions relief for nuclear constraints. I mean, everybody understands that's the shape of the deal, but they're very far apart in terms of substance. And as I said, I think in exchange for lifting all the sanctions, the ones that are really doing the most damage, President Obama will need to be able to say, when he defends the deal to Congress and the Israelis and the Saudis and others who are very worried about what kind of deal the U.S. will accept, he'll have to be able to say that Iran doesn't have the capacity to quickly rush toward the production of nuclear weapons, that he's limited Iran's physical ability to enrich uranium, and that will mean fewer centrifuges than they currently have installed. And I think we all recognize that that's a big ask. It'd be very difficult for the Supreme Leader and his hardline supporters to agree to something like that.
Well, it depends what they get in return. It depends how many of these devastating, crippling sanctions are lifted, and whether Iran is going to get official recognition for its right to enrich uranium in its own oil soil. Now, if they get that, I think what you describe are the elements of a good compromise, because Iran at different times have agreed with every single one of those points you have said. Different Iranian leaders have agreed with those. But now we got to put them together as a package. And the US has to do that. But in order for this to succeed, what do you think Iran and the US can do to build confidence? Because the two countries have been at war for over 33 years. And the nuclear issue has been an issue only for the past 10 years. What can we do besides having conversations like this to build confidence on the part of the US or the part of Iran?
Well, I mean, my advice to the negotiators is to start with small agreements. Okay. I just don't think there's enough trust, and the two sides are too far apart for a comprehensive agreement. So I would start with something small, as I talked about, yes. Modest sanctions relief for modest nuclear constraints.
Step by step.
Step by step. Yeah. I think that's the only way to go, precisely because, as you say, the two countries have been hostile for so many years, and we have very different national interests. Now, there are other issues out there, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. But on most of those issues, the US and Iran have very different interests, and in fact, we're on opposite sides. So whether or not we can find areas to cooperate on in those other issues that would facilitate progress on the nuclear issue, I'm not convinced that there's much out there on which we have a common basis.
Let's assume that the rapprochement doesn't happen. And let's assume that the two countries, the US and Iran, cannot agree on a nuclear deal. Now, President Obama is on record for saying Iran is about a year to two away from building the bomb. Now, if these negotiations fail, what can the US do?
I think certainly if the negotiations fail, the US will proceed with additional sanctions, and Congress has already prepared the next sanctions bill that will pass with overwhelming veto-proof majorities and will come to the president for his signature. I think the Iranians will respond by expanding their nuclear program, by taking further steps to increase their capacity to enriched uranium and build up their stockpile of enriched uranium. But at the same time, I think the Supreme Leader has been very careful to avoid taking actions that he thinks will trigger a US military strike. So and in fact, if you look at the Iranian program, there's a lot of self-restraint. They could be doing much more than they're actually doing, and I think that's because he is deterred by the fear of a US attack. So I can imagine a situation, even if we don't have a formal diplomatic agreement, a piece of paper where both sides agree to a quid pro quo, I could imagine some tacit understandings, some implicit understandings, so that we could proceed with the current situation and avoid a conflict. I mean, the one thing, or one of the things that the two leaders agree on, Supreme Leader doesn't want to get bombed, and President Obama doesn't want to bomb him. So at least there's some basis on which the two could agree to avoid a conflict.
So you do not think that a military option is a good option?
Well, I don't think it's a good option, but I think and I think, as I say, up to now, I think the threat of military force has been effective in limiting some of Iran's nuclear activities. But if that were to fail, if the Supreme Leader were to make a misjudgment, let's say, I don't think this is likely, but if he were to make a misjudgment and to do something to move directly in the direction of building nuclear weapons, for example, by beginning to produce weapons-grade uranium, then I agree with President Obama. I think the US would have to use military force to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons because of the damage that that would pose to US national security interests.
When Ahmadinejad was elected as president, Iran had about 200 spinning centrifuges. Then in the course of the 8 years, the most crippling sanctions were imposed on Iran. And today, Iran has 18,000 centrifuges. Yes, the Iranian economy has been devastated, but Iran's nuclear program had made impressive advancement. Now, therefore, the question I have is, how realistic is it that we keep talking about attacking when the threat of force, yes, has prevented Iran from building the bomb, but your assumption is that they want to build the bomb. My assumption is that they only want to build the infrastructure to build the bomb. And therefore, they're doing exactly what they want, and threat hasn't worked. How do you respond to that?
I mean, my guess is that there are probably lots of different views in Iran on the question of how far they should go with their nuclear program. As on most issues, there are very diverse and complicated views. I suspect that some Iranians, probably Rouhani and Zarif and people like that, would agree with the idea that they need to create a capacity, an option, but they recognize that actually building nuclear weapons would be very dangerous because it would invite an American attack, it would upset the neighbors, so they'd be prepared to live with a threshold capacity, the option without actually exercising it. But I think other Iranian leaders and officials, maybe even the Supreme Leader, think that the best way to defend themselves and the best way to assert their dominance in the region is to have nuclear weapons, is to physically have nuclear weapons. And as I said, I think what has stopped them up to now has been the fear of exposure and US attack. So I think it probably is an unsettled issue in Iran how far to go up to the threshold. Where they are now is probably not very satisfactory because they're at least a couple of months away from producing enough weapons-grade uranium for a bomb, and then they'd have to do the additional work to fabricate and build a nuclear weapon, and that's where President Obama says a year or two away. That's not a very practical capability. So I think they want to try to shrink that timeline down as much as they can, maybe to a few weeks, while avoiding a US military attack. And they proceed very cautiously and incrementally to advance the program while avoiding a war.
And what do you think would happen if, in case of a war? Let's assume that, I'm going to become now pessimistic, quite pessimistic.
Right.
Let's assume all of that failed. And President Obama is informed that, look, these guys are about to have the big one.
Right.
And we decide to attack.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
Well, I mean,
what is the likely scenario you see?
First of all, I would say I think we have the military capacity to truly destroy or very significantly damage the nuclear infrastructure. So unlike Israel, I think the US actually could do a very effective job of physically setting back the program for years. On the other hand, I think the question of what would happen as a consequence is one of the big restraints. It's one of the big unknowns and one of the main reasons why military force is such an unattractive option. First of all, we don't know how Iran will retaliate. I think we have to assume that there'll be some retaliation. Will it be directly through missile attacks on US forces in the region or on Israel? Will it be indirectly through Hezbollah or other actions, through terrorist actions? All of this could easily escalate and trigger a much larger scale war, which obviously would be dangerous not only in terms of threat to US forces, but also could threaten the access to oil through the Straits of Hormuz and could have a tremendous impact on world oil prices. Secondly, one of the big concerns I have is that if you bomb Iran, it's likely to consolidate internal views on the desirability of having nuclear weapons, and it would give the Iranians a good excuse to leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, in which case they could rebuild their nuclear weapons program in secrecy. There would be no international inspectors. So you might delay the program by a couple of years, but make the problem even worse. And since the Iranians have mastered the technology, as you say, unless we invade and occupy the country, we can't take away the basic technological capability that they've acquired.
So in the worst case scenario, we go and destroy their nuclear facilities, but then we make an entire country angry, nationalistic, that now we have to build the bomb. And unless you go and overthrow the regime, putting American troops there, they're going to do it. So 5 years from now, Iran is going to become a nuclear power and an enemy of the United States. Is that a good alternative?
Well, we don't know what will happen 5 years from now.
No, but I'm saying if the scenario you're describing, if we don't send the troops in, and if the government decides to build the bomb, and if they build the bomb, these are all three big ifs.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to make the argument that I don't think the military option is a good alternative. The US can devastate Iranian nuclear facilities. There is no question about it. And I don't think Iran can retaliate as badly as a lot of people think. Iran is no match for the US. But the day after, 2 years after, a decade after, what's going to happen? You remember everybody was so happy about Saddam Hussein being overthrown quickly. And look where Iraq is today.
Well, I mean, I agree that the military option is not a good option, but it also isn't a good option to acquiesce and allow Iran to get nuclear weapons.
I agree with that too.
That's the dilemma that we're trying to avoid, right? The president doesn't want to have to choose between attacking Iran or acquiescing to Iran getting the bomb. That's why this diplomatic effort is so important, and why, as I say, I do think we bought time. I mean, I really believe that US actions through export controls and sanctions and diplomacy and other activities really has slowed the program down significantly. I mean, I'll give you a very good example. You know, we detected the construction of this secret enrichment plant in Qom during the Bush administration. So we were watching this plant being built, and when President Obama came in, we knew that this plant was under construction. And we planned very carefully when we would expose that plant to maximize political pressure on the Iranians. And for a while, it slowed down work at the facility. They were forced to open it to IAEA inspection, so it could no longer be used as a secret facility. So I do think we have options available that are available to us before we have to resort to military force. And as I said to you, I think it's that if we continue to operate with a credible threat, I think it's likely that's the best way to avoid having to actually use force.
I think your point that Obama doesn't want to bomb Iran and Khamenei doesn't want to be bombed is a very good summary of that. But going back to the nuclear facility, the secret nuclear facility, the Islamic Republic claims that they are obligated to report to the IAEA only 180 days before they actually put any centrifuges in those facilities. Am I right? They had not put the facilities when we exposed them. Am I correct? So technically, they were not violating NPT provisions.
Yes, and the Iranians are very good at constructing legalistic technical arguments.
Yes.
But
look at the Persian carpet, and then you understand how they go around.
But the truth is, I'm utterly convinced that this was a secret facility built and designed for the intention of building nuclear weapons. No doubt in my mind. And only after it was exposed did they say, oh, well, actually, this is to produce fuel and we have to be safe from those Israelis who might bomb it. Frankly, I think that was all after the fact explanation. And I'll go further and say I think that within the next couple of years, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to build the Son of Gom, another secret enrichment plant. Because if you're the supreme leader and you want to have the option to build nuclear weapons, having a secret facility is the best way to do it, safest way to do it.
Maybe they already have it. Who knows?
Who knows?
Now let's move away from the nuclear issue and go to another simple, easy problem, and that's Syria. You and I had this disagreement in Washington in the last conference, I remember, where you said Iran and the US have no common interest in Syria. I disagreed with you then, I disagree with you now. But let me just ask you this before I talk about my disagreement and why I think the two countries do have some common objectives there. But tell me, are you optimistic about Assad's regime agreeing to dismantle these deadly chemical weapons in its country? Or do you think he's going to play around and keep some of those at the end of the day for it?
I have to say that when the agreement was first announced, I was very skeptical that Assad would cooperate. But I have to say what's happened since then over the past month has been pretty impressive. He made a declaration to the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which I'm told we think is credible. May not be everything, but it's a lot. Almost 1,000 tons of chemical weapons and precursors and other agents. So far, he's let the inspectors in, operating freely, and they've already even begun to do some of the destruction work. So the best explanation I have for his behavior is that he may have concluded that the chemical weapons are really not necessary or useful for him. He's winning the civil war with conventional weapons, with heavy artillery and planes and so forth. And to use chemical weapons, he now knows it's extraordinarily dangerous because it could provoke an American attack on his forces that might actually affect the balance of power in the Civil War. So he may have decided, and he's under tremendous pressure from the Russians to agree to give up the chemical weapons because Moscow doesn't want to have any pretext for US intervention. So Assad may have decided for now to sacrifice the chemical weapons in the interests of keeping the US out, especially because the Civil War is actually going pretty well for him. You know, the opposition is in such disarray, he's even starting to, recover some territory. And in the meantime, he just continues to pound parts of cities that are controlled by the opposition in Damascus and Aleppo and so forth. Now, I still think there's a reasonable likelihood or risk that he will try to conceal at least some of the chemical weapons. And it will be very difficult for the inspectors to really verify that everything has been declared and destroyed, especially in the context of a civil war. But even if we get only 80%, that's still a tremendous achievement and really limits his capacity to use those chemical weapons against civilians. So I think that will be a big win for the U.S. and for U.S.-Russian cooperation.
But didn't the UN inspectors that went to Iraq prior to our invasion did a much better job than American intelligence agencies about the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? Everybody thought they had it.
Yes.
But the inspectors told us, no, we have pretty much cleaned it up. And they did a fantastic job.
Yep.
And many of them were, of course, Americans. Why do you think that they can do as good a job in Syria to get, especially because the Russians have every interest, so do the Iranians, who, by the way, have been supporting this. They have every interest to prevent President Obama from attacking. So I think they're going to put a lot of pressure on Assad to get rid of everything, not to give any pretext to an American invasion. Is that a pretty good assessment?
Yeah. As I say, I think the Russians, the Americans, all have a strong incentive to make this chemical weapons elimination program work. And for now, Assad also appears to be cooperating with it. And we'll just have to see how it goes. But I think there's a good argument to be made that we can get most of it. And even if you don't get everything, that's still a big achievement.
During our informal conversation, as we were enjoying our Italian food, we talk about Syria, and you essentially argued that the U.S. was wrong in not providing great deal of support to the Syrian opposition at the beginning of the civil war in Syria about 2 years ago. And of course, I disagreed with that. I thought President Obama did exactly the right thing to be careful, not to get itself involved in Syria. Now, this is 2 years ago. The reality today is different. We have 35% of the opposition, between 20 to 30%, who are terrorists. We know that now. And so what should the U.S. do now? What should they do with the opposition? Forget about 2 years ago. Right now, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's a terrible mess. I really don't think we have many options available to us. If we were to make a decision that we were going to try to arm and train a Syrian opposition that we thought would be closer to our interest for what Syria would look like after the conflict, it would take years. It would take, a lot of manpower, a lot of money, and I just don't think, the administration or the American public, for that matter, have the stomach for that kind of deep engagement, for what would be involved. So I think what's likely to happen, of course, we're doing some small-scale arming and training, but it's at a level that isn't really going to make much of a difference in terms of changing either the balance of power with the Assad government or within the opposition, where the jihadists right now seem to have the upper hand, al-Nusra and other groups. So I think what's likely to happen is that we and other countries are just going to sit on the sidelines, and this civil war will just grind on for years. It's a very sad situation, but I don't think there's any appetite for us to do anything decisive to try to affect the outcome. And of course, Secretary Kerry is making a very valiant effort to try to, organize a new peace conference in Geneva with Foreign Minister Lavrov. But at this moment, I don't see any basis on which a political settlement is possible, because the differences, within the opposition group and between the opposition and the Syrian government is just too vast to be bridged by diplomatic means.
Would you agree with me that the single greatest threat to American interest in Syria is if the Syrian state completely collapses? Because if you look at what happened in Iraq, I think the greatest mistake the U.S. made in Iraq was to dissolve the Iraqi army right away. That created a security vacuum, and everybody took advantage of it. I don't think we want to do this in Syria. I think the best alternative is to keep the state intact, but to get rid of the top leadership, at least to get rid of Assad. This is where Iran and the US can work, because neither country wants to see the complete destruction of the state, of the Syrian state. Is that not a common objective?
Yes, I think it's a common objective, but the question is, who do you put in place of the top leadership?
Geneva II can become the arena where Iran and Russia, Saudi Arabia, and other countries can find a solution. You have to find a regional solution to Syria. There is no other way. Would you agree with the regional approach?
Well, I mean, my disappointment has that we really haven't seen an alternative to Assad emerge that commands the kind of support both in the region and within the country that's a credible alternative. And in the absence of that kind of, I call him, this person, the George Washington of Syria. Until we see the George Washington of Syria, I just think you're going to continue to have this kind of anarchy. And the big obstacle to diplomacy is that there isn't I mean, we were lucky in the case of Afghanistan, right? We had Karzai, who, whatever you think of him, there could be regional agreement. I mean, the Iranians, the Americans, the Russians, Pakistanis, everybody agreed that he made sense to put in place as head of the new Afghan government. We don't have that kind of a figure in the case of Syria. So in the absence of that, and I don't know how we can invent such a person, I just don't see where there's an option for us to work together to put somebody in place to replace Assad.
What about the 20 to 25%, 30% opposition to Assad that are essentially affiliates of Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups? Can't US and Iran have collaborative work to eliminate that threat? Because right now, part of Syria is becoming very much like Afghanistan. Yeah. Is there not? Again, I'm trying to see if there are areas where, as we negotiate on nuclear issue with Iran, we can begin to cooperate together on other issues so that we can end 33 years of animosity. Do you think there is a possibility where we can collaborate in that area?
Well, you know, I think that these Al-Qaeda type groups are a common enemy to both the US and Iran. But the question is, what practical cooperation can Tehran and Washington put together in order to affect what's happening inside Syria?
Well, they had Afghanistan model. The two collaborated, as you know better than anyone else, they collaborated to get rid of the Taliban. And then, of course, President Bush came out with that axis of evil speech, and everything then went its way. But there are ways that they can collaborate if there is a political will. But I'm not very sure if Iran is ready, at least if the supreme leader is ready for that. Now, let me ask you, you also worked very much on North Korea. Do you see any similarities between Iran and Korea in terms of the way they negotiate and the way they deal with the nuclear issue?
I think there are some big differences. I mean, in the case of North Korea, I always thought that there was no ambiguity about their intent. That for North Korea, having nuclear weapons is an existential necessity. I mean, they see themselves as a very weak country surrounded by stronger, richer countries that they don't trust. China, South Korea, Japan, the United States. And there's a consensus within the North Korean elite that they need nuclear weapons to survive. As we've talked about, I think Iran's, or the elite view in Iran toward nuclear weapons is much more complicated. There's a much broader range of views. And so from that standpoint, the situation in North Korea is much simpler. It's much more cut and dry. And you know, frankly, we have much fewer levers of influence in the case of North Korea. They're not really part of the world economy, so sanctions don't work very well, especially if China continues to protect North Korea, whereas Iran, I think, is much more vulnerable. It's much easier to impact, to influence Iranian decision-making.
Oil-producing country.
Exactly.
They cut off their oil revenue.
Exactly, and they sort of depend on the world financial system because they have money. The North Koreans don't have any money, so just a couple of banks, right?
Mr. Rodman can help him with this. Now, what about in terms of style of negotiations? Do you see differences, or it's
Well,
basically the
yeah.
same?
No, I don't think it's the same at all. I think that in the case of the North Koreans, when we got down to business, when we actually tried to hammer out the 1994 agreement, they were very transactional. I mean, I had a good negotiating partner who spoke very good English and was very personable, and we were able to really do business. I haven't had that experience with Iran. Not that they're incapable of that kind of transactional negotiation, but for the last 5 years, they've been avoiding negotiation. And so that's why it's been so frustrating that the Iranians were simply not able to sit down with us and try to negotiate an agreement. Maybe under Zarif and Rouhani, that will take place, and that'll be one of the big things we should look for in the Geneva meeting that takes place on Monday and Tuesday. Will the Iranian delegation have the authority? Will they be authorized to meet with the US delegation bilaterally? Because you can't negotiate in a big room with 8 parties. I mean, it's just too complicated. Any deal's got to be done between just a couple of people sitting in a room together. That's how it always is. And up to now, the Iranians have simply refused to meet with us, so we couldn't negotiate.
Well, we had Mr. Zarif, Iranian foreign minister, meeting with Secretary Kerry
And
for
that
the
was a
first
good
time.
sign. That was a good sign. And now the question will be, can the actual negotiations are always done by, not by the secretaries and the foreign ministers, it's always done by the experts who have to sit down and actually, craft the precise language.
The technical part, yes.
The technical part. What sanctions will be lifted, what nuclear constraints will be put in place, what will be the sequence, the phasing, how will we work out simultaneity. All of those details have to be worked out by the experts, and if the experts are allowed to meet together, then that'll be a good sign.
Compare Iran under Ahmadinejad, the guy who denied the Holocaust,
Well,
idiotic comments, denied that there are even homosexuals in Iran.
Yeah.
I mean, compare him with Zarif and with Rouhani. In less than 2 months, we've had an American president picking up the phone and talking to the Iranian president. And we had Iranian foreign minister talking with American foreign minister. That is incredible. That is why I'm cautiously optimistic, and I want to push so that we can somehow reach an agreement. I have one final question, and then we open it to question and answer. And this had nothing to do with Syria and Iran, and we did not discuss that during our lunch. So in a way, I'm betraying you. But I think it's an easy question. We just heard that the US is going to cut off some aids, military aids to Egypt. Mm-hmm. Do you welcome this? Do you think it's a good posture? Is that a necessary posture, or you think it is ill-advised?
I'm not a strong supporter of these kinds of symbolic actions, because it seems to me we're trying to have it both ways. We're trying to send a message to the Egyptian military that we're unhappy with the fact that they mounted a coup to overthrow a democratically elected government. But at the same time, we obviously have very strong interest in preserving our close security relationship with Egypt because of common concerns about terrorism in the Sinai and the peace treaty with Israel and so forth. So doing these kinds of symbolic measures, it seems to me you end up with the worst of both worlds. You show that you're not really prepared to take effective action, and yet at the same time you anger the people you're trying to remain on good relations with. So, I think whether we like it or not, the situation in Egypt has taken a turn beyond our control. And, I think we should be focusing on trying to encourage the Egyptian military to allow for new elections to take place and to try to hand over a government and try to hand over things to a civilian government. And I don't think these kinds of gestures are very effective in terms of moving them in that direction. I think instead they just seem to be annoying them.
Well, now what I'm going to do, if you don't mind, to open up the floor to the audience. And here are my rules. And since I have the microphone, I make the rules. I'm going to go first to our students, USF students. And then when they are done, we go to the members of the community. Please give us your name and ask a question. That means at the end, there should be a question mark. And be brief, no introduction. He is quite knowledgeable about the topic. Just raise your hand and ask your questions. And because we are only 2 microphones for live streaming, I have to repeat your question. So who wants to go first? Yes. Thank you. The question is, what role does Israel play in Iran's nuclear negotiations with the U.S.?
It's a very good question. Part of the complication for the U.S. in these negotiations is that we have very nervous allies in the Middle East who are worried that we'll accept a bad deal that will leave them exposed to the threat from Iran. So whether it's Israel or Saudi or Turkey, part of the job of the U.S. negotiators will be to closely consult with them, keep them informed, and try to persuade them that whatever deal we're negotiating serves their interests. That's particularly important in the case of Israel because any deal Obama makes, he has to be able to sustain it politically. He needs to be able to convince Congress not to pass legislation that would take away his authority to lift sanctions. And obviously, Israel has influence with Congress. So I think that, I know when I was in the White House, we spent a tremendous amount of time consulting with our Israeli allies, with the Saudis, the Turks, and all the European allies to get them on board with whatever approach we were taking. And I'm confident that the administration will continue to do that. Now, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has laid out publicly what he considers to be acceptable conditions for a nuclear deal in his UN speech a couple of weeks ago. And basically, it's total elimination of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and all nuclear material. Now, of course, that's a very desirable objective, but I don't think we can achieve it in this negotiation. I don't think we're in a position to dictate terms to the Iranians, and I don't think the Iranians are so desperate that they'll capitulate to whatever we demand. So I think, I do think we have the advantage in these negotiations because of the sanctions, but I don't think our position is so strong that we can force the Iranians to accept a lopsided deal. If there's any deal, it will end up being something like all deals where neither side gets everything they want. It'll be a compromise. And we'll have to try to persuade the Israelis that that compromise serves their interests, and the best way to do that is to actually have an impact on Iran's nuclear capacity, which is what we talked about in the beginning.
Next. Yes, the gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Ellis, and my question is, if Iran...
Yeah.
Let me repeat
Sure, of course.
3 softball questions. If Iran becomes a nuclear power, will they use it against another country, or would it be for deterrence purposes? And will they give it to another terrorist organizations? And if so, identify those terrorist organizations. And if you can answer those today, I'll be really, really grateful to you.
I mean, obviously, this is just speculation, right? But I think the way people think about it in Washington, I'll speak mainly about myself, but my colleagues, I think the threat of Iran providing nuclear weapons to terrorists is seen as the lowest likely threat, because presumably the Iranians would recognize that if they did that, there'd be a very high risk that it would be detected, and if terrorists use nuclear weapons, obviously we and others would hold Iran responsible. So they would probably be deterred from deliberately providing nuclear weapons to terrorists. What is more likely is that if Iran had nuclear weapons, they would feel much more courage, they would feel more protected to be aggressive in their foreign policy, because they'd be protected by nuclear weapons. So for example, they could take a much more aggressive position in terms of supporting Hezbollah, or taking actions to try to intimidate the Saudis and others who don't have nuclear weapons. And so one of the big fears people have is that if Iran got nuclear weapons, it would lead to a cascade of nuclear proliferation in the region. And the incentive for other countries like Saudi and Turkey and Egypt to get nuclear weapons would be very strong. Now, most of them couldn't get nuclear weapons quickly because they just don't have the scientific or industrial infrastructure. But over time, they could move to develop nuclear weapons, and you could end up with a situation where you had multiple nuclear powers in the Middle East, which is a very frightening formula given the instability and the conflict in the region. And out of that kind of situation, you could have nuclear use in the same way that the US and the Soviet Union came close to using nuclear weapons in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, both sides understood that the use of nuclear weapons was extraordinarily costly because it could lead to, devastating damage. And yet, in the context of a crisis that threatened to escalate, both sides were thinking very seriously about using nuclear weapons. So you could imagine something like that happening in the Middle East, let's say a confrontation between Israel and Iran over southern Lebanon. You could imagine a situation in which one side or the other felt compelled to use nuclear weapons early in order to preempt the other side, and you could have use, even though everybody's perfectly rational and understands that the use of nuclear weapons would be devastating.
One of the arguments that some people have made about why Iran should not have a nuclear weapon is they say that the Iranian leadership is irrational and that they have this martyrdom complex, that they want to die.
Right.
Now, I can tell you, and I can say that with certainty because I've been studying it for a long time, and I happen to know the way the Islamic Republic operates. They are not suicidal. They like idiots who do acts of suicide on their behalf, but they won't do it.
Yeah.
They know if they have the bomb. They know it better than anyone else. And the Islamic Republic respects power. And when you talk with them decisively, they react decisively. They know if they build the bomb, they won't be able to use it because they are going to be devastated and Iran is going to become one huge parking lot. They won't do it. The reason why they want to build the infrastructure is because they think it gives them the deterrent capability. They think with that they can do exactly what you suggested they can do. They can become a regional, an important international player. Now, I think for the audience, it's very important for them to know that the first agreement to build a nuclear reactor was signed with Western countries in the 1970s when the Shah of Iran was a strategic ally of the United States. His thinking is not very different than the thinking of the Islamic Republic when it comes to nuclear capability.
Yes, I agree. And what's especially interesting is that historically, the Shah was interested in developing the same kind of what is called fuel cycle capability, enrichment and reprocessing, as Iran is pursuing now. And it was really the intervention of the United States under President Carter that stopped that. So, in a way, history is repeating itself, where you have President Obama saying, yes, Iran can have a peaceful nuclear energy program. We recognize that and respect that, but we don't want Iran to have the capacity to produce fissile material that can be used for nuclear weapons. So in a way, there's been a lot of consistency, both in the Iranian government under the Shah and in the U.S. government, going from Carter to Obama.
Next. Yes.
Thank you. Do you want to?
I let you
Okay.
answer that question.
No, that's right. Well, just one point of fact. I mean, actually, Iran doesn't have any so-called HEU, highly enriched uranium or weapons-grade uranium. What they have is a stockpile of nearly 20%, and they have a stockpile of 3.5%. But 90%, which is the normal figure for weapons-grade uranium, they don't have any of that yet. And I think that's, even though this hasn't been publicly identified, I think that's one of the most important objectives of U.S. policy, is to prevent Iran from acquiring either a stockpile of HEU, weapons-grade uranium, or prevent them from having the capacity to quickly produce a large amount of weapons-grade uranium. So as I said right now, with their current capability, they could probably produce, a significant quantity of weapons-grade uranium in a couple of months. But of course, that would be detected very quickly by the IAEA inspectors, and that would give the U.S. plenty of time to take military action if we decided to destroy the facilities. So part of what Iran is trying to do is to creep closer to having a very rapid capacity to produce weapons-grade uranium. And the way you do that is by putting more centrifuges into the ground. Right now, they've got 18,000. If they had 30,000, they'd be much closer to having what is called a breakout capacity. And the more stockpile they have of low-enriched uranium, the quicker they can move to weapons grade. Because as opposed to natural uranium, you're starting with a stockpile of stuff that's already partially enriched. So the U.S. objective, as I said, will be to limit the number and type of centrifuges that Iran has, and to limit their stockpile of enriched material so that they can't move quickly to produce nuclear weapons.
And they're trying to do the exact opposite.
And they're trying to do the exact opposite. And that, I mean, that reflects, at the heart of this negotiation is a fundamental difference in national interest, right? Iran wants a nuclear weapons capability for reasons that make perfect sense from their standpoint, and we want to stop them from having that capability for reasons that make perfect sense from our standpoint. Whether a compromise can be reached where they have some capacity but short of a rapid breakout, whether the two countries can live with that kind of a situation is what this negotiation is fundamentally about.
Well put. Now we can expand it to anybody who is present here. Let me start with Dr. Peter French.
Early on in your conversation, possible there's an opportunity. Reasonable at this point?
Well, I mean, I'm always in favor of those kinds of collaborative efforts, but frankly, if you can't deal with the nuclear issue, they will all be washed away. I mean, the nuclear issue is the big elephant in the room, and we don't have a lot of time, to build trust through these other mechanisms, which I'm very much in favor of. I mean, President Obama recently lifted the ban on sports exchanges, so there will be ping-pong diplomacy, which is all to the good, but unless you grapple with the nuclear issue, I don't think these other things will substitute.
I agree with you, except long term, and you want to got to give people something.
Right. I agree. I think as many students as we could have in our country as possible. Yeah.
That's why I allowed you to be the first speaker, because I know you're an optimist. Questions? Yes. Yes. Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think our allies are afraid that we secretly are contemplating containment. And that's one of the reasons why Israel and Saudi and others are so nervous, because they think we've given up on trying to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think when Obama said, as he did a year ago, that he's come to the conviction that containment is too risky for the United States to accept, and that our policy has to be prevention, including, if necessary, the use of military force. I think he means that. I mean, I think he came to that intellectual judgment. Whether right or wrong, I think that's his belief. Now, of course, it's quite possible that no matter what we do, at the end of the day, Iran will get nuclear weapons. Even if we bomb them, that only delays the threat. So if we are confronted with that situation, which I don't think is likely in the near term, but if we are confronted with that situation, we will have to use the tools of containment. And we're very knowledgeable about that. I mean, that's one thing we know how to do from the Cold War. Now, whether it can be as effective in the Middle East as it was in East Asia and Europe, I'm very skeptical, because we were able, in the case of the Europeans and our East Asian allies, the U.S. security relationship and the guarantee of U.S. protection, including the nuclear umbrella, was very credible and effective, and led most of them to decide we don't need nuclear weapons, we can count on the Americans. I think our reputation in the Middle East is not as strong. I think we're not seen as reliable. This goes back many, many years, but our reputation is at a low point right now for a variety of reasons, and I think it's very hard for us to have the credibility to assure those countries that they can depend on us and they don't need to have their own capacity. But I don't know, I'd be interested in whether you think that pessimistic assessment is correct.
No, I think here I have to agree with you because we're getting closer to our dinner time, and I want to make sure that, no, I think I agree with that assessment. I really do. Yes.
Well, of course, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is very strained right now. I mean, the Saudis were extremely upset when President Obama called for President Mubarak to leave office. The Saudis were upset that we, in their view, were too friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood, which the Saudis view as a threat. The Saudis are very unhappy that we're not doing more to help the Syrian rebels. Saudis are very nervous about our negotiations with Iran. They don't think we've done enough on the peace process. So the Saudis have a long list of grievances. At the same time, we have a lot of strong common interests. For example, putting pressure on Iran. I mean, one of the reasons why we've been so successful in reducing Iranian oil exports, persuading customers to stop buying oil from Iran, is because Saudi has increased production and made oil available, especially to the big Asian customers. Japan, Korea, India, China. So, you know, we and the Saudis have no choice but to work together, but at the same time, there's going to be different interests, and the Saudis seeing an opportunity now to, you know, for the Egyptian military to consolidate power against the Muslim Brotherhood, the Saudis are going to take advantage of that opportunity by providing funding. You know, I do think at the end of the day, the U.S.-Egyptian relationship will get patched up because we have such strong common interests. But, you know, not through our fault, but just through the way that events have proceeded, we've ended up antagonizing everybody in Egypt, right? The secular forces, the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, everybody's angry at the U.S.
But in defending President Obama, this is really ironic that I'm defending him and you're being critical. But in Egypt, everybody is angry today.
Yes,
at each other.
I said it wasn't our fault. That's just the way things happen.
Because we had a democratic election, and then the military decided to have a coup d'etat. It's that simple. And I think it's very difficult to agree with Senator McCain, but he's absolutely correct. There was a coup,
no question about it.
And the U.S. should recognize it and punish those who have staged a coup. Either you have to be for democracy and be consistent, or just don't give any lip service to it and just say, look, this is our national interest, we'll follow it. But going back to Iraq, the question the gentleman asked, going back to Saudi Arabia, let me add one other point of disagreement between the US and Saudi Arabia, which I think is more important than all of them. And that is what the US did in Iraq. When the US decided to overthrow Saddam Hussein, in the eyes of the Saudis, the United States opened up the Middle East to the Iranian influence. And they still have not forgiven the US.
You're absolutely right.
That was the key element in this.
Yep. But as I say, at the same time, the US and Saudi, in a way, even though we have so many areas of disagreement and don't understand each other very well because culturally we're so different, we also have a long relationship based on mutual necessity. And I think that'll continue.
We're going to have a couple of more quick questions. Professor Hiba Hashish from our department.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I was surprised, and what the Saudi government put out the story that they did this as a protest because they didn't think that the international community was providing enough support for the Syrian opposition. And I think the Saudis genuinely feel that, they're engaged in a proxy war against the Iranians, and the battlefield is Syria. And the Iranians and the Russians are all in helping Assad with weapons and money, and some people even say Quds Force fighters from Iran fighting alongside. And the Saudis look around and say, well, our friends the Americans are not really doing enough. And also there's, as I'm sure you know, some tension within the anti-Assad camp between Turkey and Qatar on one hand and Saudi and the UAE on the other. So I think it represents, as I say, a genuine Saudi unhappiness with the way things are going in general.
And the last question, the gentleman right there. Yes, you. Yes? Did you raise your hand? Yes. Oh, go ahead and ask, please.
My question was, no matter what President Rouhani, the decision in Iran lies with the ulama. Leader is bound to them. With the trust deficit that exists now, them to come.
The unfortunate situation is that President Obama's efforts very early in his administration to try to have a genuine development of trust and confidence with Iran was rejected by the Supreme Leader. And we can speculate why, but very clearly he was not prepared to agree to President Obama's overtures to try to find a better basis for the relationship. And as a consequence of that rejection, the US shifted to a strategy that's essentially coercion. I mean, essentially, we're using economic threats and punishment to try to force Iran to make concessions. Well, that's not a very good basis for trust. In fact, it reinforces in the Supreme Leader's mind that the real objective of US policy is to overthrow his government. And in fact, the economic sanctions are so serious that they may actually threaten the stability of the government. But the Supreme Leader created that situation by rejecting Obama's offer to set up a genuine bilateral dialogue. Whether we can get back to that or not is going to be very difficult. And I completely agree that people-to-people contacts are extraordinarily important, and in the long run will be very effective because, I mean, as we all know, the young people in Iran are very pro-American. I mean, when I was there in 2005, I was told over and over again by younger educated people I met that they loved President Bush because he was in favor of freedom, and they really liked that.
Can I interject for a
minute?
Yeah. I was recently on this question with General David Petraeus. Asked him the same question. You said Obama had overtures, reached out to
Iranian government. But do you remember who he appointed as his envoy? Dennis Ross,
Well, yes,
Jewish man,
yes.
to go and negotiate with Iran. How will it be perceived?
Well, I mean, do you think that's why the Supreme Leader rejected?
You know more. The perception is a lot.
I can tell you, Dennis Ross's religion had nothing to do with the rejection by Ayatollah Khamenei. He doesn't care what religion you have. He's smart enough to know what policy you pursue. I think that's the key element. But going back to the attitude of Iranians toward the US, you can consult any poll that have been taken by American companies. And the Iranians today are the most pro-American population in all of the Middle East. Go and look at the popularity of America in Saudi Arabia. The problem we have with Iran is with the government. The problem we have with Saudi Arabia is with the people who have a different point of view. Same thing about Turkey. Turkey is a member of NATO. And the popularity of the US there is less than it is in Iran. That is why Peter French is absolutely right. I'm right. Both of us are right. That we need to build confidence. And that's why you're here.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why the Supreme Leader fears the United States is because he knows that much of his population would welcome better relations with the United States. And from his standpoint, the biggest threat to the survival of his government is not sanctions, it's not military force, it's subversion through American culture and ideas. I mean, his big fear is the Green Revolution, a Green Revolution that is, against the theocracy. So I've never been convinced that I think it's possible that the Supreme Leader prefers to have an antagonistic relationship with the United States and is nervous that a good relationship with the US may in the long run be fatal to the Islamic Republic.
We know of many people who have met with him privately. They all say the same thing. They say that Ayatollah Khamenei does not trust America as a negotiating partner. And his view is that for 33 years, the US has been undermining the Islamic Republic. They have not accepted the Islamic Republic. But I think President Obama has changed that. The fact that President Obama has talked to the Islamic Republic, has written to the Iranian president, I think he has significantly diminished that fear of mistrust by Ayatollah Khamenei. And I hope he listens to this program, and I can tell him that things are getting much better in Washington.
I hope so, too.
To have this audience captive for almost hour and a half without them leaving is a miracle. So I really want to first thank them and then thank you for coming to USF and for having this wonderful, wonderful conversation with me. And I hope you do not mind that I proved during the conversation that I was right just about on every point, and you were wrong on all of the points you made.
So, Will, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good. He is coming to your defense.
Well, we'll have to do this again in a year, and then we'll see who was right and who was wrong.
Thank you very much. Thank you, folks. Great. Really great.